On the 24th of May 1565, the Ottoman artillery opened fire on Fort St. Elmo, one of the fortresses of the Knights Hospitaller. This was the beginning of the so-called Great Siege of Malta. Behind the artillery, an army of 40,000 soldiers was waiting to conquer the island, sent there by Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, who wanted to strengthen the position of the Ottoman Empire in the struggle for supremacy in the Mediterranean and wipe out the Order of St. John, also known as the Knights Hospitaller, once and for all. But the Knights, together with the Maltese militia and a number of mercenaries, put up a fierce fight. Europe was trembling as the siege developed into a war of attrition of epic proportions. The possibility of an Ottoman bridgehead so close to Italy had never been more real. Before we dive straight into the video, a quick lesson on credential stuffing, which is how most account hacking happens nowadays. If you have used your usual email address on a website that was not properly maintained or got compromised, it might end up on the dark web. So if you have one password for more than one login, somebody might successfully log into your accounts. An easy fix is enabling two-factor authentication and tools such as the dark web monitor of today's sponsor NordVPN to get alerted. Be sure to use a password manager like NordPass to generate strong, unique passwords and always have them at hand without actually having to remember them. NordVPN also comes with a threat protection feature that keeps malicious websites, annoying trackers, and irritating advertisements at bay. Get Nord for the price of a cup of coffee per month by clicking on the link in the description below. All of this is entirely risk-free thanks to Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. As soon as Sultan Suleiman I, known as the Magnificent, rose to power in 1520, he pushed the expansion of the Ottoman Empire. His armies quickly secured control of most of the eastern Mediterranean. In 1522, they also conquered the island of Rhodes, which was then home to the Knights Hospitaller, who were a Catholic military order founded in Jerusalem after the First Crusade. After the fall of Jerusalem in 1291, they established a domain on Rhodes, where they thrived until 1522. 8 years later, Emperor Charles V granted them Malta as a perpetual fiefdom in exchange for one falcon annually. However, according to Kenneth M. Seton, an expert on the Crusades and Ottoman-European relations in the Mediterranean, the island was, quote, a defenseless, barren waste, end quote. Nevertheless, it had become the Knights' new home, and they immediately began to turn it into an important maritime center. At the same time, the Ottomans were expanding their influence in the western Mediterranean. The Barbary corsairs, privateers in Ottoman service, were gradually becoming an ever greater threat, especially a certain Dragut, called the Drawn Sword of Islam. He was constantly at odds with the Maltese Knights. A few years later, in 1551, he and the Ottoman admiral Sinan Pasha attacked Malta directly. They landed on the island with about 10,000 men, but left only a few days later to conquer the neighboring island of Gonzo instead. Dragut then sailed to Tripoli, which was also garrisoned by the Knights, defeated them in a short siege and took control of the area. Tripoli then became the new center of corsair activity. Shocked by this direct blow, the Knights instantly set to improve Malta's defenses. They expected Dragut to return soon. Over the next few years, the situation in the Mediterranean remained tense. By 1559, hardly any coast in the western Mediterranean was safe from Dragut's corsairs. Among other things, he plundered the Spanish coast, which prompted Philip II, together with his allies, to equip a large fleet in order to drive them out of Tripoli. The Knights Hospitaller also joined this operation, but this mission failed. An Ottoman fleet under the experienced Admiral Piyale Pasha surprised the Christian ships near the Tunisian island of Djerba and defeated them. Afterward, the Grand Master of the Order, Jean Parisot de la Valette, expected the worst. He ordered to rebuild the fleet and had his men prepare. He was sure that the Ottomans would strike again, because foreign observers in Constantinople had reported that the Sultan was preparing a formidable fleet. Malta was an obvious target because the island was not only the headquarters of the knights and thus of the Sultan's enemies, but also very significant strategically. It was the stepping stone to Sicily, from where the way to the western Mediterranean and especially to Italy would be wide open. When one of the most notorious sailors of the order, Maturidon de Lescaut, also called Romga, attacked several merchant ships and captured the governors of Cairo and Alexandria, this was the straw that broke the camel's back. Suleiman decided to conquer Malta and annihilate the Knights Hospitaller once and for all. When the Ottoman fleet was spotted off the coast of Malta on the 18th of May, the Knights were ready. The Grand Master had made sure that plenty of supplies were stocked and that the defenses were prepared. The Knights' new home was situated ideally for a siege. Everything vital was located on the two peninsulas of Birgu and Senglea, accessible only from the land side, where they were each guarded by a moat and massive walls. For some years, the Knights had reinforced Fort St. Angelo, their headquarters, and built two new fortifications, Fort St. Elmo and Fort St. Michael. These two fortresses had been raised in less than a year and now guarded the city's weakest points. St. Elmo towered over the entrance of the Grand Harbour, and St. Michael barred the way from the south. Between Senglea and Birgu lay the city's galley port, which was blocked by a heavy iron chain. So anyone who made it past the new Fort St. Elmo into the Grand Harbour was going to be met with mighty bastions, massive ramparts, and a chain blocking access to the heart of the city. Malta was an indefensible waste, no more. When de la Valette learned that the invasion was imminent, he summoned the Knights of his order from all over Europe. But it was clear that the Knights Hospitaller wouldn't be able to defend the island without allies. So, for this reason, the Grand Master turned to the Catholic potentates of Europe for help. First and foremost to Pope Pius IV and King Philip II of Spain, who had an immediate interest in Malta because of his possessions in southern Italy and Sicily, and had an obligation to help because the knights were his fiefs. Both the Pope and the King promised their help. While more members of the order and financial aid from all over Europe were on their way to Malta, those who were already there prepared the defenses. They cleared the terrain in front of the walls by demolishing many of the buildings south of Birgu and Senglea. In addition, de la Valette ordered all grain, ripe or not, to be harvested and brought to the city, along with other supplies. The Ottomans should not find any food on the island. To the same end, he had all the wells which were not vital for the defenders contaminated, probably with animal carcasses. This scorched earth policy would shape the character of the fight decisively. The Ottomans were facing a set of formidable fortresses, which, according to the historian Desmond Seward, were defended by some 500 to 600 knights and 1,200 soldiers from Italy, Spain, and Greece. These professionals were supported by non-professional fighters such as sailors and civilians. Although the Maltese population had never been fond of the Knights Hospitaller, whom they regarded as occupiers, need prompted a large number of them to join the ranks of the defenders. All in all, the Ottomans would have to wrestle the sturdy walls off the hands of 6,000 to 9,000 men. And the clock was ticking, for relief could arrive anytime. On the 19th of May 1565, the first 500 Ottomans set foot on Malta at Marsa Sirocco, a port 6 kilometers south of the Grand Harbour. The Grand Master sent a detachment of cavalry and 300 arquebusiers to welcome them, but after a brief and bloody skirmish, the Maltese had to retreat. Their mission had been futile to begin with, as became clear when 25,000 more Ottomans landed on the island the next day. The invaders immediately began to build a fortified camp south of the Grand Harbour. There were so many of them that offensive action was out of question. And yet even further Ottoman reinforcements were to arrive over the course of the next few days, especially the corsairs under Dragut. According to the Sultan's orders, Dragut was to assume supreme command. This was quite extraordinary because the Sultan's own commanders were men of high rank as well. The fleet was commanded by Piyale Pasha, the hero of Djerba, and the land forces by the experienced Lala Mustafa Pasha. There was an ongoing rivalry between these two because Mustafa Pasha had been given special authority by the Sultan. Because of that, they had a hard time to agree on a strategy in their Council of War on the 21st of May, which was held just after a reconnaissance expedition had led to initial engagements south of Senglea. Dragut had not arrived yet, so they had to talk it out among themselves. Piyale Pasha wanted to take Fort St. Elmo to give his fleet access to the port and the Grand Harbour. Mustafa Pasha was not too fond of this, and instead wanted to attack the poorly guarded inland capital of Mdina first, so that they could avoid attacking St. Elmo and operate from a secure base afterward. After some discussion, Lala Mustafa gave in. He thought taking the fort could only be a matter of days. The same day, Ottoman workers set up a battery between the fort and Mount Skiberas, near present-day Valletta, and soon the first cannons opened fire. Simultaneously, sappers were digging trenches to cut St. Elmo off from the land side and slowly approach the walls under cover. Because of the rocky ground, this was hard work, and, fortunately for the defenders, progressed only slowly. The Ottomans' slow progress allowed the Knights Hospitaller to supply and reinforce the fort. On the 28th of May, the last large bombards were installed, and the fight for St. Elmo began in earnest. When on the 2nd of June, Dragut finally arrived on the island with the bulk of his corsairs, the drawn sword of Islam set up camp in St. George's Bay. He did not agree with the chosen plan of attack, because he considered conquering St. Elmo a waste of time. However, it was too late to change plans now, so St. Elmo served its purpose perfectly. It bought the Knights Hospitaller a lot of time. Because the Grand Master, Jean de la Valette, was well aware that the only way to prevail was help from outside, he devoted much of his energy to get assistance as fast as possible. He asked the man in charge of coordinating the Spanish support, Don Garcia de Toledo, who was the Viceroy of Sicily, to hurry up. The latter, however, hesitated because Philip II had ordered him to intervene only if he could do so without endangering the Spanish fleet. Thus, de Toledo asked for patience. Also very actively beating the drum on the political stage was Pope Pius IV. He urged the Catholic princes to send men, money and gunpowder to Malta, and even ordered a force to be raised for this purpose from his own resources. But despite the Pope's admonition, and the general concern raised across Europe by the proximity of such a formidable Ottoman fleet, little was happening for the time being. On the 3rd of June, another battery opened fire on Fort St. Elmo from Dragut Point. The resulting artillery barrage kept the defenders so occupied that they only noticed the attacking Janissaries when it was too late. The Ottomans quickly seized the Ravelin, and in spite of 5 hours of fierce fighting, the defenders couldn't retake it. This was decisive because the Ottomans now held an elevated position right at the walls of St. Elmo. They finished a new artillery platform on the ruins, and their cannonballs started to shatter the walls from close range. Over time, constant battle and dwindling supplies weakened the defenders. After another assault on the 8th of June, the demoralized knights asked de la Valette for his consent to withdraw, but the Grand Master ordered them to stand firm. He knew they were fighting a losing battle, but every day they resisted meant an additional day for help to arrive. Soon, the walls of St. Elmo were crumbling. 2 more assaults on the 15th and 16th of June were barely pushed back. But in the Ottoman camp, Dragut was dissatisfied. St. Elmo was costing the Ottomans far too much time. To speed things up, he ordered his ships to join the bombardment from the sea, and personally visited the trenches to instruct his artillerymen to aim lower and thus bring down the walls more quickly. But his impatience was to cost him dearly. The sources disagree as to whether he was struck down by a lucky shot from St. Angelo or whether one of the gunners he was correcting accidentally aimed too low. In any case, a stone or bullet hit him in the head. 5 days later, the drawn sword of Islam died of his injuries. Regardless of the setback, Mustafa Pasha, who was now in charge, finally managed to cut off St. Elmo by establishing another battery on Gallows Point. This left St. Elmo under fire from all sides, so that the conditions of both the defenses and the defenders deteriorated quickly. When further assaults branded against the defenses on the 21st and 22nd of June, the defenders couldn't prevent the Janissaries from lodging themselves in on the walls. Starved, exhausted, and nearly overrun, the knights' resistance on the following morning was a symbolic formality. They stood no chance. The Ottomans entered the fort and killed all the defenders except for a handful of lucky ones who managed to swim to safety. The events following the fall of St. Elmo are highly controversial. For example, the archivist Catherine Desportes reports that Lala Mustafa Pasha had the bodies of the knights mutilated and thrown into the sea and the heads of the fort's commanders impaled along the shore. De la Valette allegedly responded by having the Ottoman prisoners beheaded and their heads shot from the cannons of St. Angelo. However, many historians doubt that such atrocities actually occurred, because the primary sources give conflicting evidence. Nevertheless, what is certain is that the Battle of St. Elmo cost many lives. According to the historian Bruce Allen, about 1,500 defenders and 6,000 attackers died, including half of the Janissaries. But what hurt the Ottomans more than the loss of their soldiers was the delay of more than a month. After investing so much time, all they had to show was a pile of rubble once known as St. Elmo. It was a Pyrrhic victory. The day after the fall of St. Elmo, the Ottomans turned their attention to Senglea and Birgu. They moved their fleet to Marsa Musceto and transported their guns to the other side of the bay, where they built new batteries on the heights of Corradino and St. Margaret in order to shoot at St. Michael and the Borgo, the residential area at the land end of the Birgu Peninsula. Before the attack began, Mustafa Pasha sent a Spanish slave to De la Valette with a message to ask if he would receive an embassy offering free passage for all knights, men and artillery, if he surrendered. But the Grand Master knew he could not trust the Pasha and replied that he would hang anyone who dared to bring him such an offer. Contrary to Don Garcia de Toledo's promise, there was still no help in sight by the end of June. The Spanish viceroy took so much time to prepare that rumors spread in Constantinople that he was actually assembling a large armada to strike eastward, while most of the Ottoman fleet was trapped in Malta. In Catholic Europe, people started wondering about the delay as well, so that de Toledo came under increasing pressure and had to act if he didn't want his reputation to take damage. In late July, he gave in and dispatched 4 ships to Malta. The defenders sighed in relief when a messenger from Mdina brought news on the 2nd of July that 700 men under Melchior the Robles, including 40 knights and 20 artillerymen from Sicily, had landed at the northern end of the island. This so-called Piccolo Soccorso, the small relief, marched south the next day. Under the cover of a foggy night, they marched along the west coast in a large semicircle and slipped past the Ottomans to Calcara Bay, where they were picked up by boats from the Borgo. When the sun rose over Malta, the guns of Senglea were manned by fresh and able gunners. The ranks of the defenders were filled with rested men, and most importantly, their morale was boosted. This boost was sorely needed, because the atmosphere among the defenders was becoming more tense by the hour. The Ottomans completed their batteries south of the fortifications on the 5th of July. 112 cannons opened fire on the Borgo and Fort St. Michael. Protected by the barrage of this extensive artillery, the Ottoman workers took to the shovel once more. Slowly, they dug their way towards the walls. When the Ottomans finally set up another battery on Mount Salvador, northeast of Calcara Bay, to bombard the southeastern end of the Birgu, bullets rained down on the defenders from all sides. The ground was prepared for a general assault. Mustafa Pasha didn't content himself with bombarding. He decided now was the time to mount a first general assault. He wanted to overrun the Senglea Peninsula, seemingly the weakest point in the defense, by attacking it from land and sea. Because St. Angelo was still a formidable threat to any ship entering the Great Harbour, and he preferred stealthy preparations, the Ottomans hauled boats of various sizes over land from the Marsa Scirocco. It was laborious work, but little by little, a fleet was assembled in the Grand Harbour, hidden behind the Corradino. But despite the efforts to hide the operation, it did not go undetected. To strengthen the weak point in the defense, the Grand Master ordered his men to drive stakes into the ground along the west coast of Senglea, about 10 paces from the shore, and connect them with a heavy chain to prevent the boats from landing. At the same time, the knights built a bridge of barrels and planks across the southern end of the galley harbour so that they could send reinforcements and supplies back and forth in case of emergency. When the Ottomans opened a dense barrage on Fort St. Michael on the 13th and 14th of July, it had become crystal clear that something was going on. Early in the morning of the next day, the attack began. The best Ottoman fighters, according to the historian Kenneth M. Seton, about 3,000, boarded 100 boats and rowed towards Senglea. At the same time, the corsairs advanced on St. Michael. The defenders were awaiting the approaching boats nervously and breathed a sigh of relief when the chains held. The barrage forced the Ottomans to disembark early, which meant their powder got wet. As they were slowly wading to the shore, the defenders pelted them with large stones and fended them off with their spears. All the same, the numerically superior Ottomans made it to the beach. The battle raged fiercely on both fronts, and soon the defenders had to retreat. At St. Michael's, Melchior de Robles and his men held back the attackers bravely, but when a powder magazine exploded and tore down a part of the wall, the situation seemed hopeless. But now the newly built pontoon bridge came into play. 5 units from Birgu rushed over it to join the Robles' men. This brought the Ottoman wave to a halt. Still, the Pashas were not done yet. They sent another 10 large boats with about 1,000 janissaries to the tip of the peninsula to outflank the defenders. This attempt, however, failed because of a low-lying battery near the chain that was blocking the galley port. The Ottomans only noticed it when it opened fire at the boats. Within a short time, the close-range fire sent 8 ships and 800 soldiers to the bottom of the Grand Harbour. With this, the tide turned. The attack from the water became hopeless, and the corsairs at Fort St. Michael had a hard time against the reinforced defenders. After about 5 hours, the fighting petered out and the Ottomans retreated. On this day alone, they allegedly lost about 4,000 men. Slowly but surely, the siege turned into a battle of attrition. The unfolding events shocked not only Pope Pius IV, but all of Catholic Europe. The situation of the defenders was getting worse and worse, and the possibility of Malta falling into the hands of the Ottomans became ever more real. If the Ottomans controlled Malta, they could invade mainland Europe from the south at any time. Pius did everything in his power to prevent this nightmare from becoming a reality. But raising money and support was difficult and slow. In an attempt to help in whatever way possible, the Pope issued a plenary indulgence to everyone who gave their lives defending Malta. If he could not fill the empty granaries and powder towers, he at least wanted to raise the morale of the defenders by forgiving their sins. Back on Malta, the Ottomans refrained from direct assaults for now. They took a strategy that was less risky and cost fewer lives. Mustafa Pasha now planned to close the gaps in the Ottoman lines to establish a full encirclement. His artillery should batter against the fortifications until a breach large enough for the Janissaries to comfortably storm through it would open up. A hail of bullets, exhaustion, and starvation were to wear the defenders down. The defenders were already next to exhaustion, but de la Valette had them work hard day and night to repair and improve the defenses. He knew all too well that his defenses had two weak spots. St. Michael seemed to hold for now, so he turned his attention to the exposed southeastern side of the Birgu. He had the bastions of Castile and Germany reinforced to make an approach from land more difficult, in order to block Calcara Bay to prevent an outflanking maneuver by sea. To do this, his men sank ships loaded with stones in a line across the bay and connected them with chains and anchors. This made approaching the Birgu from sea almost impossible. On the 24th of July, the Ottomans finally managed to close their encirclement completely. The Knights of Malta were cut off. Communication with the outside world was now only possible thanks to brave men who risked their lives in order to secretly swim to Calcara and bring messages to Medina. However, the defenders were not the only ones operating in secret, as they learned at the end of July. The Ottoman trenches nearly reached the walls of St. Michael when the defenders suddenly noticed movement under the fort. It didn't take them long to figure out what was going on. The Ottomans were notorious for their use of mines, after all. As quickly and quietly as possible, the defenders stuck a countermine, and indeed, they found two mine tunnels already reaching under the walls and ready to be filled with explosives. When the defenders entered the tunnels, a fierce melee ensued. Eye in eye, the miners of the two sides struggled for survival and control of the tunnel. Finally, the defenders gained the upper hand. After they had routed the enemies, they bought heavy stones and bricked up the two tunnels. They had avoided disaster by the skin of their teeth. The defenders were not the only ones suffering from the drawn-out conflict. The Ottomans were running out of supplies as well, suffered from sickness, and found themselves increasingly under pressure because they had to expect a relief army at any moment. When their cannons opened another breach in the bastions of St. Michael on the 2nd of August, the Ottomans were quick to launch another assault. Within 5 hours, 5 waves of Ottoman infantry tried to push through the gap, where Melchior de Robles and his men awaited them. Despite fierce resistance, more than 20 Janissaries made it onto the wall, where a bloody struggle for the control of the rampart ensued. After a desperate back and forth, the defenders eventually prevailed. However, in some places, their defenses were a mere heaps of rubble. Their numbers shrunk from day to day, and still no help was in sight. When a Spanish soldier defected to the Ottomans, de la Valette anticipated the worst. As expected, the defector informed Lala Mustafa just how desperate the situation of the defenders was. The Pasha immediately planned a second major attack. As dawn broke on the 7th of August, some 8,000 Ottoman soldiers charged the fortifications of St. Michael. The defenders did their utmost to stop them, but by now the walls had several large breaches and in many places had been patched up only hastily. The battle was fought as much on the walls as in front of them. The situation was even worse at the bastion of Castile, where 4,000 attackers assaulted a mere handful of defenders. Jean de la Valette himself had to intervene. Along with a few knights he had kept back as a last reserve, the Grand Master climbed the wall and bloodied his hands in the thick of the melee. Despite these last reserves, the resistance was dying away. It was only a question of time until it would break. But then, after 11 hours of incessant bloody fighting, the Ottomans retreated suddenly. The defenders believed they were witnessing a miracle. The explanation, however, was mundane. By chance, a reconnaissance troop from Medina, about 100 horse and a few infantry, had noticed that the Ottoman camp was almost deserted. Only the wounded and the sick remained in the camp. guarded only by a handful of soldiers and a number of non-combatants. The reconnaissance unit quickly set to work and eliminated the guards, massacred the defenseless, and set fire to tents and huts. Then they shouted, "Victoria, socorro! Victory, relief is here!" The Ottomans in St. Elmo noticed the disaster first. They mistook the scouting party for the dreaded relief army. Soon, rumors spread in the trenches that a Christian relief army, thousandfold superior in numbers, had landed. This seemed quite credible, because even the defenders were joining in roars of victory, and plumes of smoke were rising from the destroyed camp. The Ottomans were fully convinced that they would be crushed between the walls and the relief army, and hastily retreated. When they realized their mistake, Lala Mustafa Pasha was furious. He swore to give no quarter. Everybody within the walls knew that sheer luck had saved them. Because of this, some of the Knights of the Order of Malta proposed to retreat to Fort St. Angelo and abandon St. Michael and the Birgu. The Grand Master, however, had none of it. He did not want to abandon the inhabitants of the Birgu and, on a more practical note, knew all too well that the fort could not withstand bombardment for long if it was isolated. To make his stance very clear, he ordered that the holy relics and other valuables be brought from St. Angelo, and that then the bridge over the moat of the fortress be torn down. De la Valette made sure the Knights of Malta would not retreat, and he was fully aware that this meant death if no help would arrive soon. What he didn't know, however, was that Don Garcia de Toledo was finally assembling a fleet in Syracuse. But still, things went very slowly. When a letter from the Viceroy reached de la Valette 2 weeks later, he no longer believed in his promises of help. Meanwhile, Mustafa Pasha prepared yet another assault on the 18th and 20th of August. This time, he wanted to overrun the weakened Fort St. Michael and the bastion of Castile. According to Kenneth M. Seton, this was the largest and most dangerous attack of the siege. Unfortunately, not much about this climactic moment can be said with certainty. The sources give conflicting information and scholars are in disagreement about the events. There are some accounts, modern and historical, which mention details such as a siege tower, huge mines blowing up half of the Birgu, and a heroic last stand of de la Valette. But according to pretty much all modern historians, none of this can be confirmed. Regardless of the details, the attack would tip the scales for good in either way. A tremendous barrage heralded the assault. It did more damage to the crumbling walls than any before, and it was followed by several waves of attackers on the 18th and 19th, aimed mainly at tiring the defenders in preparation for the main attack on the 20th. For this last assault, Mustafa Pasha once again brought everything he had to the table. Meanwhile, the Grand Master mobilized every hand he could. Non-combatants had been included in the defense, but now he called anybody to arms who could hold a pike. The Maltese and the Knights Hospitaller fought a desperate last stand, but the walls of Birgu and the bastion of Castile were soon reduced to rubble. The defenders' lines began to waver. This was the end of the line, but somehow the Ottomans did still not break through, and they eventually retreated again. The Grand Master came to understand the reason only 10 days later, when a prisoner escaped from the Ottomans' camp and brought news that the situation of the Ottomans was just as dire as the one of the defenders, and that they had been decimated by the fighting, hunger, and diseases. In addition, they were running out of gunpowder. Despite their failed assault, the Ottomans managed to keep up the pressure for now. But Mustafa Pasha knew it would be a tight squeeze. Soon, the first autumn storms were expected, which would make it dangerous to cross the Mediterranean with a fleet like his. As chances of conquering the Crusaders' headquarters in time were dwindling, he conferred with Piyale Pasha again. They decided to seize Mdina and spent the winter there. When the governor of the city learned that the Ottoman army was marching in his direction, he knew all too well that his small garrison would not stand a chance. In his desperation, he resorted to a ruse. He equipped and armed as many peasants and townspeople as possible, and positioned them on the rampart in order to make the impression of a well-guarded fortification. When the Ottomans closed in, the guns of Mdina welcomed them with an intense salvo. Soon, they had used almost all of their powder and ammunition to intimidate and deter the Ottomans. Anxiously, they then waited for the Ottoman reaction. And what they had barely dared to hope actually happened. The attackers turned away. The Sultan's soldiers did not have the strength to attack another seemingly well-defended fortress. When Mustafa Pasha saw his soldiers returning to camp, he was close to despair. On the 7th of September, the guards on St. Michael's again noticed movement among the Ottomans. But something was different this time. The Ottomans were regrouping, had ships patrol in front of the Marsa Muscetto, and were tampering with their artillery. The defenders were afraid of whatever Mustafa Pasha might have cooked up. Then they spotted the sails of a fleet on the horizon. It was Don Garcia de Toledo. The defenders cheered in relief. Just before driving by the defenders, de Toledo had disembarked a relief army of just over 8,000 men under the command of Asconia della Corna, an Italian condottiero, at Melilla Bay, and then went on to Sicily to get even more troops. However, after some time, the joy of the defenders faded. For some reason, the relief army did not attack right away as expected, but remained in their camp near Medina, despite the obvious fact that every minute counted. As de la Valette should learn later, this was in line with the orders of Philip II and Don Garcia de Toledo. He had ordered Ascanio della Corna not to intervene, but to save Malta with only a show of force. The viceroy wanted to protect both his reputation and the Spanish troops. His plan seemed to work. When he received the news about a relief army, Mustafa Pasha ordered his men to abandon the siege. By the 8th of September, the Ottomans had cleared most of their positions and were embarking on their ships. But Mustafa Pasha was no fool. His scouts had been watching the debarking of the relief army, and soon brought news that it was much smaller than expected. After a quick council of war, Mustafa Pasha cancelled the retreat and had his men march north. If they could defeat the relief army before further help arrived, he expected to be in the clear for this year. When de la Corna spotted the Ottomans on the 11th of September, he had his men await them on the ridge of a hill east of Mdina. Even though the Spanish had the high ground, the Ottomans attacked. But soon their confidence waned, because de la Corna's rested troops were a tough nut to crack. After initial skirmishes, parts of the Ottomans took to flight. However, Lala Mustafa managed to keep the bulk of his men together and battle dragged on. Finally, the exhausted and demoralized invaders gave in. Half fleeing, half retreating, they flocked to St. Paul's Bay, where Piale Pasha was waiting with the fleet. While the cannons of the ships kept the pursuing Spanish at a distance, the defeated boarded hastily. When the burningly hot sun of the 12th of September was setting, the ship of the corsairs set out for Algiers and Tripoli, while the Sultan's fleet set its course for the Morea. Malta was saved. On the 14th of September, Jean de la Valette welcomed the leaders of the relief army in the Grand Harbour. They brought food and other supplies for the haggard men. It didn't take much, as barely 1,000 of the originally 6,000 to 9,000 were left. The Ottomans had suffered heavy losses too. Estimates vary wildly, but most are in the range of 25,000 dead and 10,000 wounded. Some days after the relief, de la Valette wrote to the Pope, Don Garcia and King Philip II to thank them for their help. But clearly, there was more than a strain of bitterness in his words of appreciation. By delaying the departure of the relief army, the Spanish had not only risked the fall of Malta, but also sacrificed the lives of many defenders, all to spare their own resources. The siege of Malta was one of the greatest events of its time. It attracted so much attention that the French historian Alain Bondy calls it, quote, the Verdun of the 16th century, end quote. And the Enlightenment philosopher Voltaire was sure that, quote, nothing is better known than the siege of Malta, end quote. People had followed it with excitement, fear, and terror. But now the drama of Malta was over, and it found a happy ending for the Europeans. The Knights of Malta had successfully defended their headquarters and stopped the enemy on the threshold to Europe. However, the Ottoman wars were far from over. The next year, the frustrated Sultan would direct his focus toward Hungary, where the small town of Szigetvar would bring fatal consequences both to the Sultan and his advance towards Vienna.